Good morning, boys and girls. We're on to chapter 26 in Front Desk. Where we left off last, Aunt Ling came to town, and I guess she's from the Sacramento area. And Mia had suggested that she take a look at this address of someone who she thought might have the car. It was because they're looking at addresses on the people who stayed that night when the car was missing, and I guess one of them was in Sacramento. So let's see where this thing goes. Chapter 26. It was agreed that from now on, if we put the blue hat on the front desk, it meant don't come in. Mr. Yao's here. And no hat meant come on in. We all shook hands on the new system, and Aunt Ling got into her car and drove off. I hoped she would tell all her friends, and we would soon get lots of visitors. Visitors who were heading in the direction of the four remaining addresses. Lupe was delighted to hear I was marching forward with my plan to show, not tell. She came over again the next day after school. The two of us sat at the front desk, where, as usual, she proceeded to draw trees. Why are you always drawing those things? I asked her. Lupe didn't look up. Her eyes were completely focused on the page. Today she was drawing a massive oak with tiny little lines on the trunk. I like trees, she said, shading in the bark. She didn't just like trees, she was obsessed with drawing them and was really good at it too. There was so much detail in her creations, hundreds of twigs and branches and leaves, which she would labor over for hours. She pulled out a blank piece of paper from the fax machine. Here, I'll teach you, she said. I looked at her wary. I wasn't exactly what you call artistic. My idea of a good portrait was a smiley face with sunglasses. You want to start off with the trunk, she said, pointing to my paper. I did as I was told, drew two thick lines for my trunk. Not so straight, she said. She took her pencil and started making little vertical lines, lumps, and curves in my trunk. No tree is perfect, remember that, she said. That's what gives it its character. I smiled at Lupe and how grown up she sounded. It was one of the things I liked most about her. She showed me how to add branches to my trunk. According to her, the easiest way to draw branches and twigs was to make lots and lots of tiny little V's. It was hard work making all those little V's, and I got a little impatient, so I started shading in my tree, eager to get on with it. Don't rush, Lupe said, frowning at my shading and pointing to the tiny little twigs on her own tree. See? It's all in the detail. We worked side by side for an hour, neither of us saying anything except occasionally to borrow the eraser. So deep were we into our drawings that we nearly jumped when Hank came and knocking on the door. I buzzed him in. Hey, can I have Mr. Yao's number? Hank asked. What for? I asked him. Didn't you say he had all those other motels? Maybe he needs a handyman, Hank said. You want to ask Mr. Yao for a job, I asked. I glanced at Lupe. But what? Hank said. He leaned into me. Come on, Mia. I'm desperate. I wanted to tell him it didn't matter how desperate he was. Mr. Yao was not going to go for it. Not after all the horrible things he said that night when the car got stolen. But then I looked into Hank's eyes. He was the one who first warned me about Mr. Yao. There's no way he would be asking me this if he had another option. So I dialed the number and handed him the phone. It's ringing, I told him. As Hank picked up the phone and started talking to Mr. Yao, Lupe and I hopped off our stools and went to my room. Gently, I picked up the extension. Shh. Hi, Mr. Yao. It's Hank Caleb, calling from the Cala Vista, Hank said. What do you want? Mr. Yao asked, barely hiding the irritation in his voice. I just wanted to call you and see if you need a handyman at one of your hotels, Hank said. Why? You know somebody? Mr. Yao asked. Yeah, me, Hank told him. I spent a summer painting houses. I'm good with power tools. I know how to use a pressure hose. Mr. Yao cut him off and told him flat out he wasn't interested. The answer is no, Mr. Yao said. But Mr. Yao, you didn't even let him finish, I interjected. Uh-oh. I don't need to let him finish. There's nothing handy about Hank, only ma fun, Mr. Yao said and hung up. I avoided Hank's gaze as I walked back into the front office. What's ma fan mean? He asked. I don't know. I lied. I couldn't bring myself to say that ma fan in Chinese meant trouble. All right, well, now I know a new word in Chinese. Okay. On to chapter 27. Here we go. In school the next day, Mrs. Douglas gave us back our stories. I stared at mine, lying upside down on my desk. Please read my comments, Mrs. Douglas said. I took a lot of time writing them. I have also graded your stories. A hand shot up. Did anyone get an A? Yes, of course, Mrs. Douglas said. Well, did anyone get a C? Stop fishing, Dylan, Mrs. Douglas said. All around me, my classmates started turning their stories around. I looked over at Lupe and watched as she turned hers over, and a small smile escaped on her lips. I looked down at my story. With a deep breath, I turned it around. There, plastered in red ink, on the very top of my essay was a big, fat C minus. 12. That's the number of exclamation mark my teacher used to describe how bad my writing was. Check the grammar. Tenses. Mia, don't forget tenses. You need to proofread. Uh-oh. The little minus sign on the top of the page winked at me, reminding me that C wasn't bad enough. It had to be a C minus. I stared at the red marks all over my story, a hot, bloody mess. In every sentence, there was something circled or crossed out. Why couldn't I ever get the tenses right? I could hear my mom's voice in my head shouting, Because there are no tenses in Chinese. My mother was right. How could I possibly be as good as the other kids in their language? I should just forget about the essay contest. Who was I kidding? I didn't stand a chance. If I entered, I would just be $300 down the toilet. I stared at my classmates, drinking in their glee as they proudly waved their stories around. I couldn't stop looking at them, showing off their grades, grinning from ear to ear. I envied them with every bone in my body. When at last the school bell rang, I home, skulked home, my legs like jello, my feet cement blocks. The words, "You are never getting off your roller coaster," played in my head like a news ticker. I stashed my C minus story deep in my closet when I got home, along with the essay printed contest printout I had been saving. I thought if I hit it, I wouldn't ever have to ever think about it again. But that afternoon, the cable was acting up again, and Lupe came over. So, what did you get on your story? Lupe asked. I shook my head at her. You don't want to know, I mumbled. She shrugged. Oh, come on. It can't be that bad, she said. I didn't say anything. Who cares? It's just a grade, Lupe said. You should have seen my grades when I first started going to school here. But it wasn't just a grade. It meant I was no good at writing. And how was I supposed to win a motel if I wasn't any good at writing? Before I could help it, everything came pouring out. Lupe's eyes bulged when she heard about the essay contest. For a second, I worried I had made a terrible mistake telling her. What if she applied for it herself? But then she reached over, took one of the guest comment cards, and scribbled something down. She handed me the card. I looked down at it. It said, You can't win if you don't play. I looked back up at Lupe. But it costs $300 to play, I reminded her. Lupe shrugged. My dad says in America, you gotta pay to play, she said. I looked out the window at her dad up on the roof, climbing down with all those thick wires around his shoulder. Suddenly, Lupe got quiet. What's wrong? I asked her. Nothing, she said. I knew it wasn't nothing. So I asked her again. I'll be sad if you move away to Vermont, she whispered. This almost knocked me over. It had never even occurred to me how she might feel if I won. So she had to know that there was no chance I'd win. I just got a C minus, remember? Thought this would make her laugh, but it didn't. Lupe just kept staring at the floor. She didn't even look up when her dad came in and told her it was time to go. See you tomorrow, I said. See ya, Lupe muttered. As she pushed open the front office door, she turned and said, "Oh, and Mia? Yes, I hope you win." Her words warned me. Her words warmed me all the way to my toes. All right, that leaves us for chapter 28. All right, let's see where we go. All right, have a great day.